Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 84th episode of Stories of Service, Ordinary People Who Do Extraordinary Work. And I'm the host of Stories of Service, Teresa Carpenter. And today is a wonderful Sunday. Just got back from Norway at a major submarine exercise. And today we are going to dive right into all things submarine because I have a submarine warfare officer on the show with me, Andrea Howard. How are you doing today?
Oh my goodness, I'm doing so well. I've seen your show and been a fan for a long time, and to be able to represent my little slice of the submarine community to your audience is such a huge honor.
Well, I honestly didn't time this at all, but because I have just now really dove deep into submarine operations and working with the Submariner planning team and all these things. And then this last week, we just did their opening ceremonies of Dynamic Mongoose. And then I go right into this interview. And it's the second time I've had my podcast world collide with my real life world. I had a suicide prevention guy come on who did a TED Talk. And I ended up showing his same TED Talk when I did suicide prevention training like 5 days later. So this is now the second time within just a few days. My hobby has now bled over to my real life. So it's wonderful when that happens. And I really look forward to talking to you. And first off, I'm just going to start and I'm going to read just a little bit about Andrea, and then we're going to get started into the questions. So Andrea Howard is the first and only officer in the submarine community to oversee the integration of 2 submarines with junior enlisted women, to include the only fully integrated Virginia-class fast attack. She is the senior openly queer woman in the submarine force and the first female officer to win 2 LY Spear Awards, achieving the top tactical performance at the Submarine Officer Basic Course and Submarine Officer Advanced Course. She is also the co-founder of the Submarine Officers Women's Network, which has connected over 270 submarine officers. And there's a whole lot more I could read. I actually did some Googling on you earlier, and I could read a ton more things, but we're just going to get right into the questions, and I'm sure a lot of this will come out. First off, where are you originally from, and what inspired you to join the service?
Yeah, thanks so much for that first question. It's always good to start with our roots. I want to highlight beforehand, though, that you made the first submarine pun of our episode together. You said
Submariner. Did I say that?
Well, no, but I said you took a deep dive into submarine culture. So that's our first submarine pun. I got it. We're not that we keep score necessarily, but if we did, that point goes to you, ma'am. So yeah, I'm from Norcross, Georgia. It's in the metropolitan area of Atlanta, Georgia. And I start so many of these podcasts with this punchline that it is the best place for me to have grown up in the United States of America, because it has this patchwork quilt of ethnicities, representing the entire globe. And having gone to public school there and grown up under the wing of my mom, who was teaching at the public school, I had this very international experience without even leaving the confines of Georgia, before I then went on to the Naval Academy and got to start this Navy journey and a little bit of time in the United Kingdom. For a time, we were even the fastest growing county in the United States due to a number of factors like refugees coming over from the wreckage of Hurricane Katrina and illegal immigration. And so many of my friends represented these different diasporas of people who were dealing with real issues at such a young age. And so to have keen insight into the struggles that people were going into, from the lowest socioeconomic groups in our society in Atlanta to then interacting with some of the wealthiest and most fortunate folks, I had this very deep understanding of human nature, of human desires and motivational factors. And that's something that I've kept in my pocket as I've then gone on through my time in the service. Then you asked the question, though, what made me want to join the service?
Mm-hmm.
And everybody has complex and complicated answers. I would say that mine is really twofold. The first is that I have a pretty good knack for stumbling into options that yield the most options. And so what I mean by that is I've always tried to pick roads that will yield an abundance of choice on each step that you take. And so the monolith of what I perceived to be the military was really compelling, because I knew it would be a challenge and it would offer this holistic leadership development. And I knew that I would have a job and be able to pick a warfare community at the end of my time at the academy. And since picking submarines and then viewing these next steps of iterations with each bit of progression of my career, it's just been a joy to have options and to remain committed, though, ultimately to the ideals of the Navy, which has really anchored me to this career path thus far. And then the second piece I'll say is that I love forging patchwork quilts, much like I experienced from my hometown in Norcross, Georgia. And maybe unconsciously when I joined the Naval Academy and then joined the submarine community, I recognized that the people that were going to be able to come in as women in the submarine community once it opened up in 2011, or as openly queer people in a post-down ask don't tell era, which formally went into effect, or formally the repeal formally went into effect during my first semester at Navy. I knew I would be able to help be one of the people that could sew together what this modern patchwork quilt looks like for the Navy and for our nation.
Did you go into the submarine community partially because you wanted to sort of forge that path and be one of the first women in that career field? Or was there something particularly exciting about that warfare area that drew you to want to join?
Yes, ma'am. It's a little bit of both. To be totally candid, I don't think that there was quite the level and breadth of language that we have today about inclusion and diversity for me to have consciously driven myself into the community to be one of these culture forgers. But I definitely felt the gravity of the opportunity to be one of these first women and to ascend through the ranks and represent not only women, but Jewish women and queer women in this community that doesn't have a lot of folks that look like me or have my background. But then, furthermore, I was incredibly impressed by the sailors that already were in the submarine community and the warfare objectives that they were executing on the tactical, operational, and strategic level. And that has been the piece that has, again, continued to draw me more into this community is at a higher classification level, understanding the role that submarines would play in our next conflict and recognizing how much more important it is for this community than in some regards some others to have the best performing teams, because we need that diversity of thought in order to survive in the case that conflict does break out.
Absolutely. And did you find as you were going through like your submarine pipeline, what did you find particularly difficult about the training and how did you work to overcome that?
In some ways, the training reflects the larger narrative of my time in the Navy. And what I mean by that is that there's pressures from two competing sides. The first is that the training, the way that you think, has to take place in such a fashion that there's an overarching safety and uniformity of thought, particularly given the legacy of Admiral Hyman Rickover in forging the precautions and the procedures of how we operate in nuclear power. So you're driven towards a very uniform way of thinking that is very procedure based and wants to create the same effect again and again and again to have those safe outcomes. But at the same time, all the people that are coming together to execute these procedures have to translate that highly technical material into a very strange social environment where there are human factors that don't just allow these teams to act robotically. So you have to balance the drive for uniformity with these different elements of what makes people tick. So, I'm wearing my class ring today, and it kind of embodies, I would say, this principle of marrying all these things. So I have a white opal, and it's a gold ring with some sapphire and a white opal. So blue, gold, and white, the traditional colors of the Naval Academy. But the opal's got a little bit of rainbow in it. And those two things can coexist. You can have that colorful pattern of people forming your teams to still fit within this conventional mold of what teams have to comply within and by in order to be successful.
Yeah, that's a hard thing to bridge because I will say that we tend to like to hang out with like. So people like I think one of the terms I've heard is like a duck chooses another duck. So especially I find it in social settings. That's probably where it really comes out. And so much of what we do in the military is also driven by how well we just get along socially. Because if you get along with people socially, you're more likely to get along better with them and work with them sometimes in a team. And I have found that being a different type of person or thinking differently or being quote unquote an other sometimes puts you at a disadvantage because people might not know how to interact with you just because you're different and they're just used to being around one certain type of personality or a certain demographic. And so I want to know for you, how has it been for you being the first openly queer woman on submarines or most senior, the first one of the first women in the sub community? How has it been for you? No, Jewish as well, but been fitting in, but also being able to maintain who you are, but at the same time fitting into the team? How have you been able to bridge that gap?
Yeah, I mean, that's an awesome question, and probably one of the biggest factors that folks are considering when they're making the decision about what service selection that they would like to pursue. They have to envision, how am I going to fit in with the teams that are already existing? And I'll condition this answer in particular with the statement that my experience is only one very small slice of the narrative. And so you'll have to talk unit by unit to different ladies to really get the full picture of what it is like to either show up on a platform that's already been integrated with officers and then to integrate new platforms with junior enlisted women, because each of those transition points has its own challenges and beauties that are associated with it. So I'll say what the real difference, though, from the 2+ units now I've experienced both as a permanent member of a crew and then as a writer, is the level of engagement of the triad. So I will give a lot of credit to the women at my level who are very intentional about forming networks like the Submarine Officers Women's Network in order to create that facilitation that spans across platform and across the fleet. And that's really an internal support metric that all of us have to fall back on and to utilize and leverage to be better leaders. But that said, the level of inclusion that is felt is very much so driven by the triad at a unit level. So I'll talk
Mhm.
about, for me, the experience that I felt has really been reflected, like you said, in the social settings and the off-watch interactions that I've had at different commands. I always point to the USS Indiana, which I got to ride for the submarine command course and be a department head boss lady who got to do an approach and boss around some prospective COs and XOs as we were doing an anti-surface warfare exercise down on AUTEC with destroyers. But when I was riding that boat, I very keenly observed that their commanding officer went out of his way on a daily basis to interact with members of the crew who reflected these minorities within his team. And it really set a two-toned, environment for his crew. And the first being that he showed that it was the norm for folks within his team to interact with people who weren't like them on a consistent basis. In fact, that is the standard, is to engage with folks across the entire team. But then the second effect was that if there was ever something that would go wrong, it showed that those minorities had a direct line of access, an informal line of communication with the captain that could be leveraged to squash whatever was going on that's not in keeping with, honor, courage, commitment, and respect aboard that unit.
Absolutely. That's so important, Andrea, is to have that engaged leader that walks around and just doesn't always talk shop. Is just asking how people are doing. And, I have a boss now who does that. He'll come down and just sit with my team. I'll like look out from my office and I'll just see him kind of, shooting the shit with one of my colleagues. And it's refreshing to see that, to be honest with you. There's not even a part of me that's like, oh, what are they talking? I don't care what they're talking about. I'm just glad that he takes the time to get to know our team and to have those one-on-one conversations, because I think it just brings us all together and it makes you want to serve that person and want to work that much harder for your boss when you know that they truly care about you. And I mean, he texted me this weekend and was like, "Oh, how did the opening ceremonies go? Blah blah blah. I heard you did a really good job on the pre-sale conference, on the brief." I mean, I don't know where he heard that, but I mean, just it's for him to take the time to send a text and say that it meant a lot to me. And that is really like the make or break of feeling included versus feeling excluded. Is excluded is when those things don't happen and the leadership and all the department heads just kind of go off and do their own thing and they don't invite you to do anything. And I've been in those types of social situations as well. And I can say that there's definitely a difference. Um, when you were first becoming integrated within the submarine community, did you how did that go, and what percentage were you guys at first? I mean, when you first entered, you must have been only just one of a handful of officers who were in the same category as yourself, correct?
Correct, with an asterisk. So I was really what I would call in the second wave of ladies
Okay.
that moved through. So your class years from 2010 to about 2013 were the main drivers of initial integration across several platforms. And what I mean by initial integration is that the way that we get boats to become fully integrated is through 3 waves. The first is that officers show up and integrate with at least one department head, whether that's a submarine warfare qualified department head or a supply officer. So have a woman department head on board with junior officers showing up concurrently, which wasn't the case initially because it was only the supply corps officers. And then as we had a homegrown batch of 1120s, those submarine warfare officer qualified folks, then that was when it could shift to being either a supply officer or submarine qualified officer. Then that second wave is the arrival of a senior enlisted leader. So somebody who has both chief's anchors and a submarine warfare qualification. And then that's the follow-on precursor for women of all ranks showing up and integrating. So for me, with the 2 commands that I've been permanently assigned to, I have come in at a point at which that officer integration has been complete for at least several years, but we have begun the integration process at the junior enlisted level, which has its own challenges because whereas the officers always have that rank separation between themselves and the crew, which affords some positional authority and a little bit of shielding from any sort of disrespect or cultural weirdness of integration, the junior enlisted women who come in don't have that separation in rank and oftentimes are subordinate to the folks that are then training them, qualifying them, integrating them into new divisions. So there are some different cultural challenges that arise with that. Now, that said, I got to go through qualifications with the first women who showed up on USS Ohio for the engineering department. And it was an incredibly meaningful experience for me because I got to have insight and trust with those women into the challenges that they were facing and be the primary interlocutor between my male junior officer peers who were the division officers to provide them backup and help quash any cultural issues that were arising. But then really just to be a more informal source of support for them throughout our entirety of our tours together. We always joke that there was kind of a W division on board, the women div that would congregate sometimes the women's head on board that was
Right.
us and have our powwows and information sharing. But it was a great way to keep a pulse on the entire crew just by virtue of having the trust of those ladies. So I won't negate the challenges that we faced and some of the cultural churn and awkwardness of integrating a crew, but it was, net positive in regard to building that trust ultimately across the entire crew. And then for us just becoming a more professional and, more diverse thinking organization.
Yeah, it's definitely important to do it in those waves that you mentioned. And I like the fact that they start off by putting people who are in the leadership positions out there first, and then they kind of slowly make their way in for the more junior enlisted crew. So that way, everyone has some sort of a mentor or somebody that that they can maybe feel safer going to if there are challenges, which there will be, that do arise. Because I mean, there were. I've been in for quite a while, and I remember when this happened, there was definitely a lot of pushback from like some of the more senior or more crusty, I'd like to say, people who didn't think this could work. And it really is a testament to the Navy that sometimes it needs to happen in the Navy for the greater world to see that it's possible. I mean, we can use "don't ask, don't tell" as a perfect example. That too is one of those things that happened in society and then was able to be, or not happened in society, happened in the military, and then people just kind of got used to it more. And it really did, I believe, help lead to more of a societal change. So often the military doesn't just reflect society. Society reflects the values that the military takes on board. That's why I do believe it's so important that we set the example and we do come up with policies like Women in Submarines that allow everyone who is able to perform and has the merit to do so, has that opportunity to succeed. Which does bring me to another question about, equality of outcomes versus equality of opportunity. Or I forget what the exact terminology is, but I wanted to address what your your opinion on this is when people get to a situation where people feel the person only got it because of they're a minority, or they only got it because of this. How do you bridge that divide between the quality of opportunity versus I think the quality of outcomes. I might be saying that wrong, but I think, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And to be totally candid, there is absolutely discussion around the first women who screened for executive officer within our community and its administrative boards. And the fact that the claim was that anybody who was a woman would screen for this rank. And so the way that you balance that narrative, though, is by also pointing to the achievements of these women. So, as an entering assumption, at the time that submarines became integrated, you're talking about having only about 13 women per year group making that ascension into the submarine community. And so the competitiveness of an entering argument was that you're going to have women who were highly motivated to be in the community just from an emotional and moral perspective, but then they also had to have the intellectual abilities and
Right.
communication skills to have interviewed well and to have not only met but exceeded the technical entry points to be in this community. So you already had a bunch of colloquially called hard chargers who were coming in who wanted to make an impact as team players within this community. And then a lot of the times these women's records speak for themselves. So I think on the officer side, there's a little bit of churn surrounding that, but it is definitely disintegrated as these women that have made it to the rank of executive officer now and are serving in these roles are going to succeed and have succeeded as department heads. But where I've seen more of that discussion is really on the enlisted side, because there's much more visibility around the periodicity of awards and command-wide recognition. And the fact that you have, blue jackets of the quarters and junior sailors of the quarters and sailors of the quarter that then translates into those same, titles for the entire year. And we were finding on Ohio that the women were dominating these awards on the enlisted side, even though they represented about 20% of the crew. However, if those conversations made it to me or made it to my peers, what we tried to be really emphatic about doing was just to kind of in a playful but also serious way address those sailors directly and say, well, hey, talk to me about what work that you did this past quarter. And they would list off their various maintenance items that they completed or trainings that they completed. And I would say, okay, that's fantastic. And I appreciate the hustle that you're doing. Here's what this sailor did this quarter. Like, do you think those two things are equitable? And oftentimes, and by that I mean all the time, the answer was no. The women had objectively put in more work. So I think it takes intentionality by the leaders in charge when they hear conversations like that to have really frank conversations. And again, you can wrap it in sort of a more, jockey, kind of fun.
Right.
Not make it
not as confrontational,
like personally insulting, but to really point out the objective reality that is underpinning the reason why somebody got that recognition.
Absolutely. As you progress through your career in the community, you've become somewhat public in your in your work and some of the things that you've been doing. And the submarine community prides itself on being, quote unquote, the silent service. And so I'm wondering what made you decide to become such a public face and voice within the community? Number one, why did you do it? Number two, have you received any pushback because of it?
I'll start by saying that I haven't received any overt pushback. And that might be partly because of the way that my presence outside of the whole of the submarine has evolved. It started with a really supportive team at the U.S. Naval Institute and the Proceedings magazine, because the first time that I put my voice out there was through written text and through publications with an incredibly supportive staff that made sure that the things that I was saying were very factually sound and communicated clearly. And I was able to then win an essay contest, which is judged anonymously there in 2019, that really propelled myself forward in that space and eventually onto the editorial board there. So it started with a bit more of an academic foundation. And then in 2021, I started posting a little bit more on LinkedIn and sharing just really cool pictures that I had from my junior officer tour. And one of them went viral at the end of the year, where I'm up in the bridge of Ohio, pulling into Apra Harbor, and there's an amazing shot of turquoise water in a dry deck shelter, which houses SEALs in their operations. And it got a lot of traction, and it drove home this notion for me that people were really hungry for a little bit of information about what we're doing on submarines. And I consciously or unconsciously knew that this like need from the larger public existed, because when I was doing graduate school in the UK, I would go to cocktail parties. There was kind of this trope where folks would throw out there, Andrea is going to be on submarines. And do you know how long submarines are underway? And do you know how long her training will be? Do you know she'll be working with a nuclear reactor? And people would kind of punt me into these conversations where then I would answer the same set of questions over. But it's because I was the first submariner that these folks were interacting with, and they had a genuine curiosity for not only what the small proportion of the U.S. military on active duty was doing, but a smaller bubble within that already small bubble. And so I'll say that in becoming more of this public figure, I'm really addressing 3 different communities. The first is what I'll just call the older folks, and there is a lot of power that I recognize exists in being able to jump many tiers of the chain of command and show positive representation, not only of the submarine community at large, but women in the submarine community and queer people in the submarine community, to our admirals, both active and retired, in such a fashion that when I go to events now, people recognize my face and come up and say, "Hey, I love the content that you are providing, and the stories that you are showcasing to us at the highest levels, to just have a touch point with some of the more positive experiences in your community." The second group of folks that I'm reaching are the newest folks that are entering the submarine community, to show them that there is a space where people from, again, the older demographics in the US to the youngest are celebrating the presence of these diverse groups within our community, such that these ladies should capitalize upon that and also feel comfortable writing professionally, developing a professional network online, so that they can have a more rich experience both during their time in the service and then to set them up for success afterwards. And then the last group that I'm really trying to reach, and this is where I need help because my main platform is LinkedIn, and I'm trying to get a little bit more savvy with Instagram and other platforms, but it's really the next generation of folks, because we know that we're at sort of an existential crisis with recruiting for the military at large. But then it's very hard to convince a young person that service aboard a submarine will be the most professionally satisfying for quality of life and quality of experience on board. And so showing people that you can bring a unicorn floaty underway and then bust that thing out for swim call, express yourself, like is a really beautiful and powerful thing. And I don't really use Reddit, but my sailors do, and somebody took one of my LinkedIn images and threw it on there. And so even my sailors were like, "Hey man, it's pretty cool to be in the presence of a Reddit celebrity." And I was
oh gosh,
great,
wow.
shitmates, it is what it is. So but the people want to join organizations that are fun and unique. And we have that community within the submarine service, but that story needs to be told in order to sustain that traction for the generations to come.
I absolutely agree with you. And storytelling is also an art, and it's a science in certain ways, and in the structure of how you do it and why you do it. And like you said, building that narrative. And I think that if we could teach our sailors how to tell stories, it would be such a net multiplier. It is definitely one of my missions as a public affairs officer, is to showcase with my social media presence that you can have a voice, and that you still can serve your country, and you can still be the spokesperson of a major organization while still having a personal opinion. And I think that it all goes back to, like you said, doing it in such a way that is credible, that is done intentionally with the intent to educate, to inspire, to inform. And sometimes it can even be to advocate for change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if sailors understood that they had this type of power at their fingertips, they'd be unstoppable, and they would feel empowered to say, wait a minute, even at my E2 level, I can make change. It might not be through the internet, but as a person within my organization, there are mechanisms by which I can seek change, or I can create something and feel proud of that. So I think what you're doing, Andrea, is really setting an example for other junior officers and even enlisted to say, look, I can go on social media as well, and I don't have to be this big, wonderful influencer like Kelly Renee Hall that is like amazing with graphics and knows how to do reels and is all those things, because not all of us know how to do all those things. But what you're showing is that you do have a story to tell, and you're using your platform and your voice to put across that story. So I admire you, and I think it's great what you're doing. Now that you've been doing it for a little while, is there any particular themes or certain types of narratives that you really want to continue to touch upon in your work?
Absolutely. There are three of them, and I was hoping for a question of this sort, so I came ready to fire. Um, but before I even dive into those themes, I just want to again emphasize the power of influence you can have both online and then external to these virtual sources. And the first I'll say that's really organic is you can just be a climate influencer at your command. So one of the things that I very weirdly and intentionally do and have incorporated now both on Ohio and at PCU New Jersey, where I am the navigator currently, is the pinky touch. And so if you go up to sailors, and I acknowledge this comes off as super quirky and you got to own it and have the confidence to do something of this sort, but whether it's like a special handshake or a fist bump or whatever your flavor is, for me it's the pinky touch. And I'll just go up to sailors and give them a little cheeky pinky to pinky touch. It takes very focused connection to do it. Sometimes I'll include like a sheesh or whatever Gen Z does is their noises of connection. But it is something that's so quirky, but that brings a smile to people's faces and just makes them kind of, inherently known that they are seen and appreciated. And I know it sounds so strange, but it's that I very cheekily like to, ask people as they give me briefs, like one more important question. Has anyone thanked you for your service today? And again, it's just one of those things that elicits a chuckle from finding a kind of clown around and be that culture influencer and bring a little bit of levity to operating and trying to construct a submarine. It makes a huge difference, and any sailor can do that, right? And then the second piece, like you talked about, of why the online platforms though are such a voice multiplier, can be reflected with an interaction that my wife and I had at the submarine birthday ball in Groton in March of 2022. So there we were, clowning around on the dance floor, and this junior sailor came up to us, as we're totally unawares of folks that may or may not be watching us because we're just focused on our friends and the situation at hand. And this gal, came up to me and said, I never thought I would see two women dancing together at a formal Navy function like this, in particular submarine birthday ball. And she's like, it just inspires me that this could be my future in this career field. And whew, it still just gives me chills to reflect upon that. But then you talk about having that interaction just on the person to person level was fantastic. But then my wife, who will self-proclaim that she's not very social media savvy, wrote about it for like a Pride Month post on LinkedIn, and it got over 1 million views.
Wow.
So to see that type of story is resounding with this broader audience of military and male spouses and civilians is just so heartening. And again, hopefully shows folks that there is an inclusive space for them to be part of our military.
Right.
Talking. So then you had asked about like particular themes that have now arisen through this work, both, forging culture on the deck plate and then online. And I'll say that it's three things. So the first is this one that I keep emphasizing, which is culture forging. And I'll give a discrete example of each of these. So in this first realm, there we were, USS Ohio, glued to the pier with a broken diesel generator, which is required for us to go underway in 2020, while we were concurrently the first submarine to contract COVID-19 on the same timeline of the national news stories about the Theodore Roosevelt. We got confined to base for 2 months, and these women who I'd gone through qualifications with and talked about, some of the struggles that they faced and different quality of checkouts and just overall feelings of inclusion on board, became the social glue for our team, because just outside of the gates of the shipyard, as we were confined to base, they would throw nightly tailgates, and it became the community center for our crew as we were forging through this uncertain time of how long these circumstances of our confinement, so to speak, were going to last. So those women became the social glue of our boat, having been this external weird entity when they first arrived. So huge transformation and ownership of the culture that they wanted to take place and then permanently be established on board. The second theme is representation, which I don't need to repeat the story of my wife and I dancing on the dance floor, but that is the pinnacle of that for me is, just by staying committed to this organization, despite its imperfections, allows people to see the future that they could have. And I have seen that reflected by, folks like Captain Emily Bassett, who's the president of the Sea Services Leadership Association, the way she's taken me under her wing and show me that, as a nuclear woman who's a powerhouse in these communities, that you can continue to build those mentorship networks and be that person that shows you what the future could look like. And then the third piece is allyship, and that story really is reflected as well in the experience that I had on USS Indiana, where the commanding officer was doing those day-to-day interactions with minorities, but then saw my eagerness to perform tactically really well and allowed me the opportunity to, in front of a group of the next wave of executive officers and commanding officers, have the highest position of authority on a warfare approach scenario, and I will say crush it and be that representation for the folks on board. And in doing so, it was awesome, because kind of the second order effect was then I had some of these commanders come up to me after the fact and say, frankly, it was a little bit weird to see women when we got on board. Not that we wanted to react that way. That's just kind of how we felt. And they were like, and you all, junior officers and myself, you all are so inspiring. And like, I want you all on my team moving forward. So, that allyship, all it takes is one person to give you a chance to then continue to grow that, web of allies moving forward.
And really, you're changing hearts and minds. There's people that probably, like you said, didn't want to have women on the ship, weren't used to it, didn't understand what it would happen, and then when they saw what value you brought to the team, their minds were changed. And then that's just going to reverberate, because then they're going to go and tell their friends how well it worked and that it wasn't that big of a deal. In fact, it was something that we all came together and rallied around each other to do and to make happen. And so it's just so wonderful when something like that can happen. And I do want to say thanks, Heidi Lenzini. She has been following my shows for quite a long time. She said, as a USNA 95 grad, appreciate you representing and wearing your ring. And she did a couple explanations, like for the non-Navy people, the triad are the senior 2 officers, commanding officer, and executive officer, plus a senior enlisted advisor on a sub. They call that the chief of the boat. And then she also said that a frigate was my summer cruise in 1994, 1 bathroom for all the officers. So we used, and I've done the same thing, the reversible tag for the male, female occupied, and we made it work. And she said, seriously, the fact that anyone chooses to go into the submarine community already means you're brilliant. And don't they trust leadership enough that they wouldn't choose the best? And that is true. I mean, I can tell you, Andrea, that the submarine community has always had such a high reputation in my mind. I'd never really worked with, and I don't know, am I allowed to use the word submariners? There's people who say no, and there's people who say yes. No, you don't call it.
It's a hot topic for debate. I like submariners, because submariners could, convey that you were below the mariners in quality.
I never thought about that. Okay.
But some people insist that it is submariner. So I'll let you say whichever, flavor you'd like.
Yeah, I've always used the word submariner, and then I've been corrected a couple times. And so then I've never really asked why. Some people like it and some people don't, but I never thought about it being subpar to a mariner. But what I can say is that the only thing that I've come close to is I've worked with a lot of reactor officers, and I've been on an aircraft carrier, and just the entire nuclear reactor or power community, or what you want to call it, just has such a high. I hold it in very high regard. I guess it's because I feel that to take on that level of academic prowess when it comes to like power school, or when it comes to the way that you guys have to conduct drills, that takes a certain, not only do you just have to maybe be naturally smart with some people, but that takes a lot of hard work and a lot of discipline to be able to do things in such a way, exactly the exact right way, over and over and over and over again. And I don't think that other communities sometimes appreciate what it is that you guys bring to the table. I really don't. So.
Well, there's a quote outside of the Nuclear Propulsion Training Unit in Charleston, and there's a second training unit up in Boston Spa. And I don't know if they have the same Rickover quote, but there's a plaque that reads, "In this school, the smartest struggle just as much as the oh gosh, okay, wait, reverse. I think it's something along the lines of the smartest also struggle to pass. So everybody is struggling." I come from a really successful academic career at the Naval Academy, where I was first academically in my class of just about 1,200 folks. And I was a Marshall Scholar and got these opportunities to do higher education in the United Kingdom, where I graduated both of those degrees with distinction, which means that, you know, I was in the top percentile of those cohorts. And then I went to nuclear training, you know, an NPTC, the Naval Nuclear Power Training Command in Charleston, to begin that classroom work. And it was the hardest academic thing that I've done to date. And then there's follow-on, you know, hands-on training at these nuclear power training units. And then down the road in your junior officer career, each officer then has to go through the PNEO course, Prospective Nuclear Engineer Officer. And what I will say is those courses alone, then coupled, like you said, with doing the in-situ casualty response and team building through these really complicated exercises, humbles everyone. So, you know, everybody struggles in this community. Everybody gets beat down by the environment and by, you know, certain interactions with the chain of command and high stress operations. And that's kind of a universal experience that we have. But on the other side of that builds the communal struggle that strengthens those bonds and allows you to celebrate the victories at a much more magnified level.
I agree. And you know, it reminds me a lot of aviators and the pilots. I mean, to me, it's along the same lines. It's just the aviators and the pilots get all those sexy headlines, and they're the cool flyboy kind of people or fly women. But it's just as difficult to be a reactor officer. I mean, the reactor guys on the carrier, they were always the ones staying behind. They were always the ones working. I remember they were constantly studying for all those different like retests and tests that they had to do. And the drills were just endless. I mean, it is just it's a crushing schedule. But like you said, I think that does build camaraderie, that builds teamwork. And so I think the question I have now then is, how does people in the submarine community achieve that work-life balance because it is so demanding?
Yeah, it is a tough question because I don't think that we've reached the right formula of that work-life balance. A lot of it, much like the culture piece, falls on the individual chains of command and really the families that are involved too. So, you know, the first piece of advice I'll give to anybody who's making a lifelong commitment to a person while being a member of the submarine community professionally is that you have to have a spouse who has a pretty high level of independence. And, you know, somebody who will understand that the share of household responsibilities, not even from, you know, your kind of typical cleanliness and cooking perspective, but even just from the longer term maintenance and, you know, upkeep of a home, a lot of that falls to our spouses. And so we are very sincere when we say that, you know, our work is only possible because of family members and spouses who are willing to look out for those of us when we are in particular underway. However, that said, the work-life balance is something that can be achieved on a command to command level. And there are certain milestones that are going to degrade the quality of life. So we've entered shift work as a command for initial criticality and then some follow-on testing, but to certify a reactor as, you know, it's the neutrons are flowing for the first time ever. And so I'll be staying every 4 nights as, you know, on the shipyard in order to stand duty, which means that this is not going to be my favorite period of time for the command. But that said, what we do at our command and where you can build that work-life balance is by being realistic about people taking breaks, at least while they're on these sea tours. So specifically, it's making sure that folks are taking leave, which is something that we're emphasizing at the highest and lowest, you know, levels of the chain of command within the military. It's finding opportunities for people to take special liberty as well, and to recognize that, you know, there are events that warrant people being away from work. So like I'm going to try to take off some time in the middle of shift work this next month. It's my wife's 30th birthday and I've missed a few of her last birthdays. And so, you know, our command values that and values professional growth opportunities as well, which is why I've been able to go to Sea Aerospace and be a speaker with, you know, CNO Richardson. So, you know, on the time off part, you have to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. But there's also that day-to-day, recognition of when folks really don't need to be there anymore, and then being appreciative of the work that people are putting in on a consistent basis. So words of affirmation go a long way, I think, in causing that work-life balance, even though the time might be a little bit more fluid. But then we really do try to push folks to not just feed into kind of what is a typical submarine pitfall of, just hanging around because other folks are hanging around finishing up work. So
Yeah.
it takes that intentionality at a command level to make sure that people are not missing the big events when they really need to be home and be there for their family and friends, and then concurrently to take care of themselves on a day-to-day basis. One more thing that I'll say too is, as a leader, it really matters that you're setting that example as well, because you're showing the follow-on folks the prospective job that they would have, both in terms of like time that you're committing to the job and using that time effectively, and then how you're taking care of yourself. So our office building right now is about a mile from the parking lot where we park, and so I run both ways to the parking lot just to show folks that like you have no excuse to not get in a little bit of cardio every day and a little bit of a workout, and to maintain that physical appearance and physical and mental health as well.
Yeah, and I do think it is so important for people to see that you enjoy the same benefits that you're affording to them, because they don't and I never thought about it like that, in the sense that you're basically giving them a window of what one day they should or could aspire to be. And if you don't give yourself those same kinds of things,
Mhm.
then they're gonna say, "Well, shit, I don't wanna ever be in charge. I'm addicted to my job. I'm always at work." And, we had the same thing in my own office with work from home. And
Mhm.
for a while, I didn't take any work from home, and
Mhm.
I was trying to learn my way about how to balance it for everyone, because at first we had a policy just for the civilians. And then I was like, "Well, no, if the civilians can do it and the military are not doing it, at some point, it's going to create a divide. So I
Right.
can't do that. So everyone has to be able to do it. So now everyone can do it." And then finally, within about the last 2 months, I went to my boss and I said, "Look, I'm going to start doing it sometimes too." And he goes, "Absolutely. When you need to do it, do it." And I did have, and it was a game changer, doing that. And so I think that it's really important for people to
Mhm.
see that when you can, and as long as there's no harm to the mission, you're enjoying or taking the same benefits that you're affording to your people. I think it sets that good example. And then another comment here, Brian, he is my husband's best friend. He says, "Much love to you both." He just goes by this name on YouTube. And then he also said, "My dad, being a submariner and electrical engineer for the Navy, wouldn't have been offended. But then again, he was born in 1937, and political correctness and hurt feelings weren't as prominent then." So, yeah, it's definitely one of those things where it's such a balance to try to get the mission done, get everything that you have to get done, and then still be able to maintain that work, the family. But if your mental health suffers, your leadership's going to suffer. If your leadership suffers, the mission suffers. So to me, it's just making sure that everything is properly attended to. The mind, body, spirit, soul, all of those things. Um, I guess, as we kind of wind down the call, is there anything else that I haven't brought up that you'd like to address?
Yeah, you had chatted with me informally before this about the pressure that somebody in my position might feel, and I think it is important to
Oh, that's
address
right. Yep.
that.
Yep.
We like to present the best versions of ourselves online in order to, in my case, build a little bit of traction for my community, to be, somebody who is able to show that the submarine community can be just as cool, if not, in my humble opinion, cooler than the aviation community, because of, the complexity of what we do, and in some ways the secretive nature of what we do as a force, and the importance that we'll have again in the outbreak of conflict. But there is a lot of pressure, and I spoke to a mental health professional once, and trying, it was somebody who's not in the military, about the position that I'm in, and I was trying to translate, I'm one of the first women in the submarine community, and I'm in the school where my tactical performance is being evaluated, and I feel like I have to finish first in this school, and then I have to continue on and be this role model for folks that are falling behind me. And this person was like, "Wow, that does sound like a lot of pressure. Like, I'm not sure I can totally wrap my head around your situation." And it did drive home this notion, like you said, of the pressure that we place upon ourselves And I want to make it really clear to the folks that might be listening that for as dedicated as I am to this community and the commitment that I've made now, before I sign my follow-on contract, I have to have a very realistic conversation with my spouse and do a lot of introspection to evaluate if this is something that on a personal level, both from the physical and mental health and a familial goal mindset that we want to continue doing. And so I think it's very important to always acknowledge that as much as I appreciate this institution and the benefits that I've gleaned from it and the work that I've poured in and the positive reception that I've had back, that at the end of the day, it is okay for me to also, at the end of my department head tour, say, this is not for my family at this point in time. So while I'd love to continue onward, and if my inside baseball that I'll provide is that I'm leaning more in that direction, it is also totally okay to not be the person that continues this charge, because as much impact as I'm able to have, there are other folks who can do equally good work and hopefully would step up in my absence.
Yeah, no, I agree, and you definitely can't stay longer than when spiritually and your heart is telling you that there's another direction and another path in another area. Have you thought about like if Andrea was not in the Navy, what would she be doing? Like, have you thought about like where your aspirations or where your goals might lie elsewhere one day?
Well, that's part of the problem, is that Andrea outside of the Navy is hard to envision at this point. And, I think that is a factor that certainly drives many folks to stay in and is one of the
Mhm.
major factors of consideration for me. I'd flirted with law school as an option in 2020 when, either through the legal education program internal to the Navy or, externally after transitioning out. During really the COVID era when I thought maybe that this profession was not exactly what I wanted to continue doing. But beyond that, I do acknowledge that there could be a space in which, again, family and myself would be on board with something more in the political realm. And we've always talked about how I've kind of stumbled into these awesome opportunities, and that there is such a compelling story there about service in the post Don't Ask, Don't Tell era, and service in a community that has required some of this culture rebuilding and patchwork quilt sewing. And gosh, what a metaphor for the state of our union right now,
Mhm.
more holistically. And so if the opportunity presented itself, I think down the road that is something we would consider, and then evaluate if we were in the physical, mental, emotional, moral health to take on what that responsibility would be.
Well, it's funny, Andrea, you bring that up because as we were talking, I was just going to say it off the call, but since you brought it up, I'll just say it. I was thinking, man, she would make a really good politician. She would be somebody that should probably run for office one day. I could see that. I mean, that's kind of what was going through my head as you were talking, and just the way that you can tell stories and the way that you describe and sort of have this sort of process by which you have approached your career and the things that you've done. We need energetic people who are willing to dig deep and dive into problems and come to a consensus with so many different stakeholders and make sound decisions. And you certainly are one of those people that can do that. So I understand completely where you're coming from when it comes to the military and where your heart will take you and where sometimes you have to make those difficult decisions and see, what lies next because life is short and you want to be able to get in all the things that you'd like to do. But this has been such an enjoyable conversation, Andrea. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on here. Anything else that you would like to put out to the audience before we wrap things up?
Yeah, I'll condition that last statement with a little more uh, context, that what brings me joy and what should hopefully bring joy to our officers and our leaders in this organization and outside are those genuine human connections that forge us, whether it's a pinky touch or some words of affirmation that you're providing to somebody who needs it the most. And that's really the underpinning motivation. And so whether it is in a political realm or just by being somebody who's very engaged at the community level, inside the Navy or wherever we land after this journey, That's what I hope people take away from this call, is that, like you said, I'm not the shiny influencer. I'm just very genuinely me, and I show up and tell my story in the fashion that feels comfortable to me, and that's what's thus far built these genuine human connections. And I hope what folks take away from this conversation is the inspiration to find micro ways to do that, or really large ways to do that, both online and in person, moving forward.
I hope so too, and that's really the crux of what this show is about, and why I started the podcast. So, your message not only just resonates with me deeply, is overall the theme of the show, and what inspired me to even start the show, which is the fact that when we show up in service to others, we not only help ourselves, we help the collective, and we gain strength, help, and support, and we really get over our shit, our proverbial crap, by by helping other people out. I really believe that. So thank you so much. I've just had such an amazing conversation with you. I am going to get on full screen here in just a moment and meet you backstage, but thank you so much for coming on the call.
Thank you so much for this forum, ma'am, and I look forward to our follow-on conversations in the years to come.
I do too. All right, folks. Well, that is a wrap for tonight. Thank you so much for joining me. Next week, I'm going to have a friend of mine, Ryan Sweezy. He is the founder of Walk the Line Foundation. So we're going to dive deep into command investigations, one of my favorite subjects, and talk a lot about ways in which I think we could reform some of the things that go on in those processes, and some of his experiences with them. So I can't wait to dive into that maybe controversial conversation, but important conversation. And once again, thank you as always for watching Stories of Service. Hope you're having a wonderful night, and bye bye now.